What frightened you most while homeless? I was only 19 when my world fell apart. One night I came home late from college and my foster parent kicked me out. Just like that, I had nowhere to go. I called a friend in a panic, but soon I realized I was truly on my own. As the truth sank in, a dark cloud settled over me. My mind raced with scary thoughts. Would I die on the streets? Did anyone care about me? Why wouldn't anyone help? Fear gripped my heart. I felt so alone and scared. The idea of begging for help made me sick. What if I could never escape this nightmare? Was this really my life now? For 7 long years, from 19 to 26, I struggled to survive. Each day was a battle against hunger, cold, and despair. I never knew where I'd sleep or if I'd be safe. The streets were cruel, and hope seemed like a distant dream. But deep down, a tiny spark kept me going. I knew I had to find a way out, no matter how hard it was. This couldn't be my forever, could it? Story 2. I was just sitting on a park bench, passing the time, when something truly startling happened. There was another homeless man at a nearby bench, someone everyone called Red. He came up to me and asked if I could watch his belongings while he took a quick nap. I agreed, and he laid down right next to me. After a while, Red sat up to have a cigarette. About 3 puffs in, he started coughing violently. His face turned a deep, alarming shade of purple in just seconds. I couldn't believe how quickly the lack of oxygen was affecting him. Suddenly, he collapsed onto his side, unconscious. I jumped up, not knowing what to do. I gave him a few firm pats on the back, yelling at him to wake up. Part of me hesitated to call for an emergency services, worried about the hospital bills he'd never be able to afford. But just as I was about to dial, after around 30 seconds, Red started gasping and pulled himself back up. He muttered something, took another drag from the cigarette he had miraculously kept a hold of the entire time. I was absolutely amazed that he hadn't dropped it, even while unconscious. The whole incident was so quick, yet so terrifying to witness. I couldn't believe how rapidly Red had gone from normal to purple-faced and unresponsive. It really drove home for me just how fragile life on the streets can be. Before delving into the next regrettable recap, please remember to like and subscribe if you'd like us to create more of this content. Thank you. Story 3. As a teenager, I had a really tough relationship with my mom, and I ended up choosing to be homeless rather than deal with the problems at home. I would sleep at the Catholic church across the street from my high school, so I could still make it to school and graduate early. Looking back, it was such a sad and lonely time. I remember feeling comforted by sleeping where they kept people's ashes. Those departed souls could offer me more solace in death than any living person could in my time of need. I used to talk to the urns, and I'm sure if there was camera footage, I would have looked completely insane. It was then that I really understood how truly alone I was in the world. Nothing drove that home more than the icy, painful reality of sleeping on concrete night after night. The cold would just seep into my bones, no matter how tightly I tried to curl up. It was an agony I had never experienced before becoming homeless. I guess you could say my teenage rebellion led me down an incredibly difficult path. But in those dark moments, I learned just how strong and resilient I could be. Even with no one to turn to, I found a way to keep going and finish school. That time shaped me in ways I'm still discovering, years later. Story 4. Becoming homeless for the first time was absolutely terrifying. I had been couch surfing with friends for a few months, not wanting to overstay my welcome, so I would lie and tell them I had other places to stay. But eventually, I ran out of options and had to sleep outside. That first night was the worst. Finding a safe, relatively dry spot to sleep was a constant worry. I ended up trying a few different spots: a park with some bushes, a tiny playhouse at a public playground under a bridge. But I was always on high alert, scared someone would spot me. Every little sound sent my heart racing, slowly passing cars. Were they going to hurt me? Distant drunks singing, would they try to mess with me? I could barely sleep, waking up shivering from the cold every 30 minutes or so. And I'm a big guy, 6 feet tall and around 190 pounds. I can't imagine how much harder it must be for women. Looking back, I wish I had just asked for help instead of trying to tough it out on my own. The temptation to turn to drugs or alcohol was there, but I resisted. I didn't want to look homeless, even though I was. I was just a prideful 19-year-old, thinking I could fix everything myself. Luckily, I made it through those 2 terrifying weeks. Now, at 33 years old, I'm happily married with a nice home. But that experience of homelessness is something I'll never forget. The fear, the cold, the overwhelming sense of loneliness, it changes you. I'm grateful every day that I was able to get back on my feet. Story 5. I was only 16 years old when I found myself in a terrifying situation that left me feeling completely alone and afraid. It was homecoming night, and my friends and I had planned to have a big slumber party afterwards. But as the night wore on, one by one, my friends started to get picked up by their parents until I was the only one left. I was about 20 minutes away from home without a cell phone to call for help. Desperate to find somewhere safe to spend the night, I made my way to a park I knew had bathrooms that locked. Curled up on the bathroom floor in my homecoming dress, I tried to make myself as small and unnoticeable as possible, shivering against the cold. In the middle of the night, my fears were realized when a group of kids came barging into the bathroom, yanking on the door and shouting. I was absolutely petrified that they would discover me there. I huddled in the corner, heart pounding, praying they wouldn't find me. Somehow, I managed to make it through the night undetected. The next morning, I walked to a friend's house, still in my homecoming dress. They were surprised to see me, but thankfully, no one commented on where I had spent the night. In hindsight, I suppose they may have assumed I had stayed with a boy, which I would have preferred to them knowing the truth. That night on the bathroom floor taught me a harsh lesson about the realities of homelessness. As that statement says, no matter what you do, concrete just doesn't get warm. The only thing that provides any insulation is cardboard underneath you. I've been homeless a few times since then, but I've always had somewhere to go. That was the only time I ever slept outdoors like a truly homeless person. And I wasn't even homeless. The fear and isolation of that experience is something I'll never forget. Story 6. I saw something that still haunts me to this day. It started with a bunch of kids being cruel to a homeless man. At first, they were just spitting on him while he tried to sleep on a bench. It was gross, but it got way worse. The man woke up and chased after them, angry and hurt. But these kids were sneaky. 2 of them snuck up behind him with some cheap wood planks. You know, the flimsy kind from IKEA. They smacked him hard, and he went down. The homeless guy was furious now, but the kids ran off laughing. He limped back to his bench, probably hoping it was over. He closed his eyes, trying to forget what happened. But those evil brats weren't done. About 10 minutes later, they came back. This time, they went all out. They started beating that poor man like crazy. It was brutal, punching, kicking, using anything they could find as a weapon. I couldn't just watch anymore. My heart was pounding as I ran over to stop them. I yelled and pushed my way through the crowd of kids. I knew I had to do something or that man might die right there on the street. Story 7. First night, my wife and I landed up sleeping outside. We slept in a local park that I knew. We had come down from the countryside and had hoped to stay with a friend. He was unable to give us a place to stay, so we had to sleep outside. After the insecurity of that first night, I told my wife that we have to find a safer place to sleep, so we climbed up the slopes of Table Mountain, about a 1-hour walk, and found quite a obscured spot amongst some bushes and trees. We cleared it out of sticks and rocks, made it a bit habitable, and then went make to the city looking for work. We'd spend the day going from one place to the next, looking for work until it started growing dark. Then we'd head up the mountain to our little spot for the night. Did that daily for a month until we were able to secure a small shack room in the townships where we stayed for another few months until I get a job offer. Was my wife's temp waitering jobs that kept us fed whilst I was looking for work. Biggest challenge was mental, keeping focused, clean, looking presentable, and just making my job looking for a job. Story 8. The scariest thing I ever saw on the streets was a man named Tony T. He was like a real-life monster from a movie. Tony used to be a regular guy with a job, but he was hooked on cocaine. Then he got lucky, or maybe unlucky. He won a huge pile of money, over $500,000. Most people would use that to change their lives for the better. Not Tony. He decided he'd never work again. Instead, he lived on the streets and smoked cocaine all day long. If you've ever seen the show Breaking Bad, Tony was just like the crazy character Tuco. Tony was always handing out free drugs, so people wanted to hang around him. But he was dangerous. You never knew when he might snap. I saw him do lots of crazy, violent things. But the last time I saw Tony, it was the worst. He beat a man with a metal pipe over a tiny bit of crack that fell in the dirt. We're talking about $20 worth of drugs, Max. I think Tony either killed that guy or messed him up for life. I tried to stop Tony, but he turned on me. His eyes were wild, and I knew I could be next. I ran away as fast as I could and found a phone. With shaking hands, I called my sister and begged her to come get me. That was it. My sister helped me get my life back on track, and I never went back to the streets. It's been 30 years, but I still think about Tony T. and wonder if he's still out there, terrorizing people over nothing. Story 9. As a teenager, there was an almost alluring sense of adventure to being homeless. Sleeping in cars, crashing on friends' couches or floors, it all seemed kind of cool at the time. My dad and I would move from place to place every few months, fitting all our belongings into an old Honda Civic. We even managed to squeeze a couch into that car once. We must have looked completely ridiculous driving around like that. The reality, of course, was much harsher. There was one apartment we stayed in that had no furniture at all, just a flea-infested carpet we had to sleep on. The landlord got so fed up with my dad promising to pay rent and never following through that he eventually just removed the front door, essentially forcing us out. Looking back, that was a pretty creative way to deal with squatters, I suppose. To get by, we'd sometimes sneak into hotel breakfast buffets, telling the servers we were guests so we could eat as much as we wanted before just walking out. It was kind of thrilling at the time, but I realize now how messed up it was for my dad to put me in that position. I guess the teenage part of me saw the homelessness as an adventure, something out of the ordinary. But the truth is, it was a constant struggle. Never knowing where we'd sleep, how we'd eat, always having to scrounge and scheme just to get by. That sense of uncertainty and instability never really went away, no matter how much I tried to convince myself it was fun. It was a tough way to grow up, for sure. Story 10. The scariest part of being homeless for me was just trying to survive the frigid nights. I'd end up sleeping on buses, burning sterno, that jellied rubbing alcohol that puts out a decent flame, just to try and stay warm. But even that wasn't enough sometimes. The only way I could try to make it through was by constantly walking, because if I stopped to rest, I'd probably just fall asleep and never wake up. One night, I ended up taking shelter under a bridge, and I woke up feeling surprisingly warm and cozy. At first, I thought I'd finally found a decent spot to get some real rest. But then the brutal reality set in. It was way too cold for me to actually be warm. In fact, I could barely move without excruciating pain shooting through my nearly frozen fingers. Struggling against the numbness, I managed to get my sterno lit, but it was such a battle. My hands were practically useless, making even the simplest tasks incredibly difficult. I don't know how long I would have lasted if I hadn't woken up when I did. That moment of thinking I was comfortable, only to realize just how close I'd come to disaster, really drives home how dangerous and precarious life on the streets can be. I'm so grateful I made it through that night. The fear of falling asleep and never waking up again was always lurking in the back of my mind. But that experience under the bridge, as terrifying as it was, showed me just how strong and resilient I could be, even in the face of such dire circumstances. It's a reminder I carry with me to this day. Story 11. At first, sleeping in my car didn't seem too bad. It was summertime, so the warmth was at least one less thing to worry about. I had a routine down, showering at the gym, spending my days at the library, then heading to work in the evenings. For those first few nights, it wasn't too uncomfortable. But then one night, everything changed. As I was sleeping in my car, the police suddenly showed up, shining their bright flashlights right in my face. They escorted me to the local homeless shelter, and that turned out to be one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. Lying there on a top bunk, trying to get some rest, I was jolted awake by a huge argument breaking out. Apparently, one guy had scored some meth and refused to share it with another. The third guy, who just wanted some peace and quiet to sleep, started screaming at them to shut up. The whole place descended into chaos. I had never been so afraid. Surrounded by complete strangers, many of them clearly struggling with addiction and violence, I felt entirely vulnerable. Every sudden noise or raised voice sent my heart racing. I just curled up as tightly as I could, praying I would survive the night unharmed. Looking back, I'm not even sure of the legality of the police forcing me to go to the shelter. All I know is that in that moment, my sense of safety and security was completely shattered. The fragility of my situation hit me like a ton of bricks. It was a harsh wake-up call to the harsh realities of homelessness and the very real dangers I was facing. That night tested my resilience in ways I never could have imagined. But somehow, I made it through. The experience left an indelible mark on me, a constant reminder of how quickly life can unravel and how critical it is to have a stable foundation. It's a lesson I carry with me to this day. Story 12. Living on the streets was like being in a horror movie that never ended. I saw things that still give me nightmares, people getting stabbed and others being raped. It was a world where danger lurked around every corner. One night, after my shift at work, I was heading to the place I called home, just a spot where I could crash for the night. Suddenly, I realized a gang was following me. My heart raced as I walked faster, trying to lose them. I don't know how, but somehow I made it without getting hurt or robbed. It felt like a miracle. But the scariest moment of my life happened when I was sleeping in an abandoned building's basement. I woke up suddenly, my eyes adjusting to the darkness. There, standing over me, was a man who didn't look homeless. He was holding a huge knife, just staring at me. I thought I was going to die right there. When he saw I was awake, he asked if I was Russian. My voice shaking, I said no. Then, as if this was totally normal, he told me he was looking for a different girl. He handed me $20 and just walked away, leaving me trembling in the dark. I'll never forget the feeling of being so helpless, so at the mercy of strangers who could hurt me. Those experiences on the streets taught me that survival isn't just about finding food and shelter. It's about somehow staying alive in a world where danger is always right next to you. Story 13. I was 36 when I became homeless. It only lasted 6 weeks. but those weeks changed my life forever. For years, depression and anxiety had been eating away at me. I lost friends, money, and the will to keep going. Finally, my girlfriend had enough. We had a huge fight, and just like that, I was on my own. I started sleeping at work. It wasn't even a full-time job, but it was all I had. Every night was like a secret mission. I had to be super careful not to get caught. It was scary, but also kind of exciting. For a while, it kept my mind off how bad things really were. But deep down, I was terrified. I knew if I fell any lower, I might never get back up. It's a trap, you see. You need to be clean, fed, and rested to get a job. But without a job, how do you stay clean, fed, and rested? Just thinking about it made my head spin. That first night was all about survival. I had to make sure I wouldn't end up on the street the next day. Somehow, I made it work for 6 weeks. Looking back, those weeks actually saved me. I was away from all the fighting. I had to face how bad things had gotten. I was forced into a regular schedule, which is really good for me, but almost impossible when you're depressed. And without bills to pay, I could save up enough for a place to live. I still fight depression pretty hard, but the fear of being homeless again is burned into my brain. It's like a fire under me, pushing me to keep going even when things get tough. I wish I could say I'm motivated by dreams of a better future. That would be healthier, I guess. But for now, I'll take what I can get. That animal fear of having nowhere to go and no one to turn to is stronger than the heavy weight of mental illness. It's not perfect, but it keeps me fighting. Story 14. It wasn't what I saw that scared me most. It was what I heard. This happened when I was living on the streets in the UK. I was only 16, hooked on drugs, and skinny as a rail. I found this old warehouse to sleep in. It was huge, like something out of a Gothic novel. 6 floors of empty space and shadows. I picked a spot on the 3rd or 4th floor. It was safer up there, away from the drunks and working girls who used the lower levels. One night, I woke up to a nightmare. There was shouting from the ground floor, and then I heard it. A woman screaming. It made my blood run cold. I wanted to help. I really did. But what could I do? I was just a kid, and not a healthy one at that. Still, I had to try something. My heart pounding, I crept down the stairs trying not to make a sound. By the time I got to the bottom, everything was quiet. Too quiet. The place was empty, like nothing had happened. Spooked, I ran back upstairs and tried to forget about it. The next day, I found out the horrible truth. They found a body in the empty lot outside the warehouse. It was a prostitute. The police thought her client had stabbed her, and she tried to run away. But he caught her and, well, you can guess the rest. I keep thinking about that night. Could I have helped her if I'd been faster or braver? But then I remember how small and weak I was back then. If I'd tried to step in, I might have ended up dead too. It's been years, but I still hear those screams sometimes. It reminds me of how dangerous life on the streets can be and how helpless you can feel when bad things happen right in front of you. Story 15. A couple years back, I found myself homeless for a few months. I wasn't completely out of luck. I had a car and a job, even if it didn't pay much. So I decided to rough it in the woods. That first night was brutal. I tried to sleep in the passenger seat of my car, but it was like trying to get comfortable on a pile of rocks. And man, was it cold. I shivered all night, wondering how I'd ended up here. But I'm a problem solver. The next day, I got myself a tent and dug out an old climbing pad I had. It wasn't exactly a 5-star hotel, but it was a big step up from the car. After that rocky start, things got better. I found a hidden spot in the woods where no one would bother me. I'd come back from work, start a fire, and cook my dinner under the stars. It wasn't all bad. There were even moments when it felt like an adventure. Don't get me wrong, it was still tough. But I had it way easier than a lot of folks out there. My job and car were lifelines that many people don't have. Living like this opened my eyes. It gave me a real understanding of what it's like for people who end up on the streets with nothing. Before, I might have walked past a homeless person without thinking twice. Now, I know how hard it is, how every day is a struggle just to survive. So yeah, I made it through those couple of months, okay? But it left me with a deep respect for anyone who has to live like that long term. Homelessness isn't just uncomfortable. It's a constant battle. It takes strength I never knew I had. And I was one of the lucky ones. Story 16. I was on the streets for a whole summer. It was rough, sleeping wherever I could find a spot. Then, out of the blue, this girl I kinda knew from parties around town offered me her couch. I thought my luck had finally turned around. Boy, was I wrong. It was the middle of the night when it happened. I woke up to screaming. At first, I thought someone was getting hurt. My heart was pounding as I listened closer. It was my host. She was on the phone, yelling her head off. But it wasn't a normal argument. She was ranting about how they were out to get her, how they were planning to destroy the world. I froze. My mind raced, trying to figure out what to do. Should I say something? Try to calm her down? In the end, I decided to play possum. I squeezed my eyes shut and pretended to be asleep, hoping she wouldn't notice me. It felt like hours before she finally quieted down. I didn't sleep a wink for the rest of the night. As soon as the sun came up, I was out of there. Didn't even stop to grab breakfast or say goodbye. Looking back, I realized she probably needed help. But in that moment, all I could think was that the streets felt safer than that couch. It just goes to show, sometimes the scariest things happen when you think you're finally safe. Story 17. I was just a kid, 13 years old, when my world fell apart. My parents kicked me out, saying they didn't want me anymore. Just like that, I was on my own. I was scared to death of going to a shelter. I'd heard horror stories from foster kids, and I didn't want to end up in that system. Plus, I wanted to keep going to my school. My friends were all I had left. There was this old beat-up trailer near my dad's place. That became my new home. But it didn't feel real until that first night when I had to choose between food and not freezing. The temperature was dropping to the mid-30s, and I only had one thin blanket. That's when it hit me. I was really on my own. The next day, I put on the nicest clothes I had, which wasn't saying much, and went to Long John Silver's. I lied about my age, telling them I was 15. They gave me the job, and I worked like crazy, rushing there after school 5 days a week. I ate so much junk food to save money. My goal was to get some kind of shelter. Finally, I bought this old 1991 Toyota Camry for $300 from a local ad. Man, I loved that clunker. At least I could stay warm in it. Things got better after that. I found an old lady who let me rent her garage without checking my credit. I grabbed a couch someone had thrown out and made it my bed. I even had internet in there. I spent most nights reading scary stories online. I wish we'd had Netflix back then. Looking back, my childhood was far from normal. It was downright terrifying a lot of the time. But you know what? It made me who I am today. I learned to roll with the punches and keep going, no matter what life threw at me. It wasn't easy, but I survived. And in a way, I'm stronger for it. Story 18. Life in the shelter was like living in a different world. One night, this guy got stabbed in the ribs. The stabber? He just walked inside and tried to go to sleep like nothing happened. Meanwhile, the victim sitting on a bench, blood spurting out of his side, and what does he do? Lights up a cigarette. When the staff called 911 and tried to help, he pushed them away, saying he was fine. It was crazy, but that was just another day at the shelter. But the worst night of my life came later. I was outside smoking when I saw this guy walk by. He'd just doused himself in gas at the station down the street. I didn't think much of it. Lots of people there were a bit off. Big mistake. 10 minutes later, all hell broke loose. A guy runs in yelling for wet towels, saying someone's on fire across the street. I thought it was probably nothing. Maybe someone lit a rug on fire or something. Boy, was I wrong. I walk out, and there's flames on one of the stairwells. At first, I thought, yep, some idiot lit a rug on fire. Then the rug sat up. My blood ran cold. Me and 3 other guys tried to put him out, but he wouldn't go out. Maybe the gas had to burn off first? I don't really remember much, except for one thing. He kept shouting, my balls are on fire! Put out my balls!" It was horrifying. He died 3 days later. They told me it wasn't his first time trying something like this. The shelter sent me to therapy after that. The therapist was great, but some things you can't unsee. I still can't watch people on fire in movies. This all happened back in 2011 in Kentucky. Since then, I've been slowly putting my life back together. I was last homeless in 2014. Things are still tough, especially money-wise, but I'm studying computer programming in my free time. I'm hoping it'll help me get where I want to be in life. Looking back, I'm not sure how to feel about it all. Some people say it might have been better to let him burn, but I don't know about that. All I know is that night changed me forever. It showed me how fragile life is, and how important it is to keep fighting, no matter how dark things get. Story 19. I was just a kid, only 9 years old, when my mom told me we were going on a camping trip. It sounded fun at first. We went camping all the time in the summer, so I didn't think much of it. But something felt off. We were packing way more stuff than usual. I remember thinking, wow, this must be a really long trip. I had no idea how right I was. At first, it was just like any other camping trip. We slept in tents, cooked over a fire, and looked at the stars. But as days turned into weeks, I started to get antsy. "Mom, when are we going home?" I'd ask. She'd just smile and say, "Isn't this great? We're getting in touch with nature." Then summer ended, and school was supposed to start. But we were still camping. I was confused and a little scared. Why weren't we going home? Why wasn't I going to school like my friends? Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months. 6 whole months of camping. That's half a year of sleeping on the ground, bathing in rivers, and eating food cooked over a fire. It stopped feeling like an adventure and started feeling like our life. Finally, after what felt like forever, we got a house. I'll never forget the look on my mom's face when we walked in. She burst into tears, but they were happy tears. She was crying with joy. Looking back now, I realize we weren't really camping. We were homeless. My mom had tried to make it an adventure for me, to protect me from the scary truth. Now that we have a real home, we don't go camping anymore. Funny how that works, isn't it? Story 20. People often think the scariest part of being homeless is other people. But for me, a big, tough-looking guy, that wasn't the case. Nobody messed with me. The streets felt safe enough in that way. No. What really scared me was something most people find beautiful: snow. I remember the day it happened. I woke up and saw those first few flakes falling from the sky. My heart sank. It was too early for snow. I wasn't ready. You see, I had this plan. I was going to get back on my feet before winter hit. The cold weather wasn't just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. I didn't have the right clothes, the right shelter, or any way to stay warm. As I watched the snow fall, I felt panic rising in my chest. Suddenly, I couldn't breathe. Tears started rolling down my face. Here I was, this big, scary dude, crying over a little snow. But it wasn't just snow to me. It was a sign that time had run out. Winter was here, and I was still on the streets. It's funny how something so pretty can be so terrifying when you're homeless. That snow might as well have been a monster coming to get me. It showed me how vulnerable I really was, no matter how tough I looked. That day, I learned that sometimes the scariest things aren't what you'd expect. A beautiful snowfall can be more frightening than any person when you're living on the streets. Story 21. My buddy was homeless for a while, moving from state to state. When he hit Arizona, I booked him a room at Motel 6 and hung out with him after work. Let me tell you, that place was like a circus. First, we met this guy in a wheelchair. He had a fake leg, but he wasn't wearing it. Instead, he was using it to hold his drink by the pool. His pregnant girlfriend was there too, puffing on a vape. They were pretty cool, actually. Then we met Highway. He was this ex-Marine turned trucker, looked like he stepped out of a 70s rock band. We spent the night drinking whiskey, and he taught me some military kung fu moves. Highway kept asking for some stuff, wiping his nose. Turns out he wanted meth. My friend knew a guy, so I left when things got too wild. The next morning, my friend told me what happened. After doing meth, Highway locked himself in the bathroom. When my friend checked on him, he found Highway naked in the tub, moaning, "I'm just horny." So my friend called some ladies of the night. Highway was too out of it to move, so my friend had one of the girls pretend to pee on him and took a picture. He thought Highway would pay him back when he sobered up. In the end, Highway didn't believe any of it happened. My friend was out $200, and we never saw Highway again. That's life at Motel 6 for you. It's not always pretty, but it sure makes for some wild stories. Story 22. When I was 17, I worked at this little pizzeria in town. Some nights, we'd have leftover pizzas that were meant for selling by the slice. This one rainy night, I had a whole supreme pizza left over. Instead of tossing it in the trash, I decided to take it home. As I was driving, wipers going full speed against the downpour, I spotted a homeless guy huddled under an overpass. My heart went out to him. Here I was with this whole pizza, and there he was, probably hungry and definitely soaked. I pulled over and backed up to where he was. Rolling down my window, I called out to him. "Hey man," I said, "I work at a pizza place, and I've got this whole supreme pizza here. Would you like it?" I thought he'd be thrilled. I mean, who wouldn't want a free pizza on a cold, wet night? But his reaction shocked me. He looked at me suspiciously and said, "Nah, you probably baked cockroaches into it or something." Then he turned away, hunching further into his ragged coat. I was stunned and hurt. Here I was, trying to do something nice, and he thought I was trying to poison him. I drove home feeling upset and confused. That experience really messed with me. For years after, I was hesitant to help people. I'd think about that guy and wonder why he was so distrustful. But now, hearing about how some people actually do give homeless folks tampered food, I get it. That guy had every reason to be suspicious of a stranger offering free food. He was just trying to stay safe. It's a tough world out there, especially for those living on the streets. I guess sometimes even kindness can look dangerous when you've been burned before. Story 23. My dad kicked me out over something stupid. Just like that, I was homeless. I changed into dark clothes, shorts, and a navy blue shirt, trying to blend in with other homeless teens. There was this shortcut nearby where homeless people often crashed. It was like a mini park, about 25 feet wide and 90 feet long, with swings, benches, and a few plants. Not much, but it was something. I picked a bench and tried to sleep. Man, That concrete was hard. Felt like lying on a rock. Sleep wasn't coming easy, and the sights and sounds around me were wild. There was this couple nearby, making out like their lives depended on it. I mean, they were really going at it, but somehow not quite crossing the line into full-on sex. It was intense. On the bench next to me, another couple, or maybe just friends, were chatting away. They were gossiping about someone they knew, their voices a constant background noise in the night. But the weirdest part? These two guys show up on expensive mountain bikes. They looked like Olympic athletes. Tall, white, blonde hair, blue eyes, all muscles. Real picture of health, you know? They stop right next to my bench, and what do? They start smoking crack. Right there in the open. They puff away for about 20 seconds, then they're gone as quickly as they came. That night, I learned more than I ever wanted to know about life on the streets. I even figured out where the drug dealers hide their stash. You see people come by and snatch it up real quick. It was just one night, but it opened my eyes to a whole different world. A world where appearance can be deceiving, and where survival means learning things you never thought you'd need to know. Story 24. I used to work at this pizza place. Every night we'd throw out the pizzas we couldn't sell, usually about 10 of them. The homeless folks in the area knew about this, and they'd come around looking for free food. Sometimes we'd see them waiting by the dumpster. Instead of making them dig through the trash, we'd just hand the pizzas over. It felt good to help people who were hungry. But then, something really messed up happened. The big bosses at the company told us to pour bleach on the leftover pizzas before throwing them away. Can you believe that? They wanted to ruin perfectly good food so people couldn't eat it. Our manager, though, he was a decent guy. He flat out refused to do it. He knew it was wrong to destroy food when people were starving. I was proud of him for standing up to the higher-ups like that. The whole thing left a bad taste in my mouth, though. I couldn't work for a company that would even think about doing something so cruel. So, I quit my job after only a month. It wasn't worth it to stick around and see what other nasty ideas they might come up with next. Story 25. Night had fallen, and it was time to get ready for bed. But this wasn't any ordinary bedroom. It was the back seat of a car. The person telling the story had to get creative to make it feel safe and cozy. They grabbed some sheets and rolled them up in the windows. This blocked out most of the world, leaving just a small gap on the driver's side. Through this tiny opening, they could keep an eye on things using the side mirror. The storyteller wasn't alone, though. They had a furry friend, a small but tough dog who was always by their side. As they settled in for the night, the person curled up on their side in the back seat. The loyal pup snuggled right into the curve of their arm, like two puzzle pieces fitting together. Everything was quiet and peaceful until suddenly the dog started to growl. The sound jolted the person awake. As their eyes flew open, a chill ran down their spine. There, just inches away, was a stranger's face pressed against the gap in the sheets. Two pairs of eyes locked in a moment of surprise and fear. The person inside the car found their voice and asked, "What do you want?" Those 4 words were like magic. The creepy stranger vanished into the night as fast as their legs could carry them. This scary moment showed just how brave the little dog was, and how quickly a car can go from feeling like a safe haven to a place of danger when you're living on the streets. Story 26. I had been living on the streets for a couple of weeks when I became friends with a couple. They seemed pretty cool, but they had a bit of a drinking problem. One night, as I was trying to sleep, I heard some commotion going on nearby. I couldn't quite make out who was involved or what was happening until my buddy stumbled over and sat down on my sleeping bag. To my horror, I saw blood gushing out of his neck with every heartbeat. It wasn't under a lot of pressure, but it was still really bad. When I asked him what had happened, he told me he thought his girlfriend had cut his throat with a razor blade. He was so drunk that he didn't even realize how serious his injury was, and he kept insisting that I shouldn't call an ambulance. I knew I had to do something, so I called the police, who then called for an ambulance. A couple of days later, I saw my friend again, still living on the streets, but with a scar on his neck. He was incredibly grateful to me because the nurse had told him just how lucky he was. Apparently, the cut was only a couple of millimeters away from being fatal. It was a really close call, and I'm just glad I was there to help him out. Story 27. I'll never forget this one night when my buddy Josh and I thought we had killed a guy, only to see him walking around a month or two later. It all started when I was homeless and couch surfing for about a year. I finally caught a break and was able to stay at Josh's house for a few weeks. We decided to pool our resources and just go on a wild bender. My thing was heroin and morphine, while Josh loved ecstasy. I smoked some tar, and he smoked some weed. I think I did too. Then we each popped triple stacks and decided to wander through the night in Oakland. Some cops passed us and slowed down, so we dipped from Jack London Square and ended up by a grocery store. Suddenly we heard screaming, but not just any screaming. It was the kind of screaming that makes your hair stand on end. Josh, who used to be a trained mixed martial artist before his life took a turn, was still a beast at this point. We both started bolting towards the screaming, rounding the back of the store to a loading dock. In the darkness, we could see shuffling and screaming. It was a fight. Then we noticed a woman, and she was the one screaming. There was some dude trying to get her pants off. In my haze, I instantly realized what was happening, and Josh and I locked eyes as I hit the attacker for the first time. I felt something and figured I had been stabbed, which only made me angrier. Adrenaline took over, and I remember rolling the guy over a few times so I could keep smashing his face. Josh was kicking the living daylights out of him too. When we stopped, the attacker was gurgling blood, and the woman, who turned out to be a crackhead, started yelling at his unconscious body and even kicked him before going through his pockets. I asked her if she was okay, but she just told me to mind my own business. We hopped the fence and followed some train tracks into Berkeley, I think. We ended up having a rough come-down on the first southbound BART train back into Fremont. Her screams still haunt me to this day. She was tough as nails, though. Those were primal screams. And who knows? Maybe she could have handled things on her own if we hadn't shown up. After that night, I spent another 10 years messing around with crime and drugs. It feels like another life now. It's been so long. I miss the adventures and not caring about anything but each other. We were just little addicts with big dreams and no idea what we were doing. Story 28. During my years as a homeless junkie and later working at a homeless shelter and on the streets, I witnessed some truly terrifying things. One incident that still haunts me is when I saw a man try to murder his girlfriend with a machete. He took a full swing at her and barely missed. My heart was pounding so hard, and I was sure I was about to witness a murder right in front of my eyes. I also saw countless overdoses and other horrible things. I remember a girl who had been badly beaten and raped coming to ask for help. I saw a guy get stabbed, and I watched as a big, heavy man had a heart attack and died, with the paramedics frantically trying to give him chest compressions. His body just flopped around lifelessly. To be honest, I saw a lot of messed up stuff during those years, but those were the moments that scared me the most. I have a million stories from that time in my life, and half of them sound fake because they're just so ridiculous and unbelievable. Story 29. In the city, there was this homeless addict couple that I used to see all the time. Whenever I spotted them, they were either passed out on the sidewalk or fighting each other right in the middle of the street. Their signature move was like something out of a crazy action movie. One of them would grab the other, spin them around, and then throw them. It was kind of like a hammer throw, but instead of a ball and chain, it was two people being flung a meter or two through the air, completely unable to break their fall. It was pretty scary to watch them repeatedly smash themselves against the hard road. I remember one time when the bus I was on almost ran them over because of their antics. Another thing they would do is just start sprinting across busy traffic for no apparent reason. It was like they had a death wish or something. One of the craziest things I ever saw with this couple was when the guy's backpack got stuck on a fence. He started begging for the fence to release him, as if it were a person holding him hostage. He was probably so out of it that he thought someone was actually restraining him, when in reality, it was just his backpack caught on the metal links. Witnessing their chaotic behavior was like watching a real-life drama unfold right before my eyes. It was a stark reminder of the harsh realities that some people face on the streets and the toll that addiction can take on a person's life. Story 30. One night, after having a meal at a local shelter, I decided to sleep in a nearby park. I hated being around there at night because some of the other homeless people would rob you. Just a week earlier, a guy had been stabbed, and I knew I needed to get out of there fast. To avoid attracting the attention of the drunks who would throw things at us, beat us up, and generally harass the homeless, I started making my way out of the area using alleyways. As I was walking, I heard a commotion and decided to investigate. What I saw next was something straight out of a horror movie. There was this crazed, animal-like man, naked from the waist down, on top of someone who I assumed was a woman. He was thrusting on top of her, stopping every couple of seconds to throw a punch. The woman was completely unconscious, her body limp and covered in blood. I yelled out to him, and he turned to look at me. I've seen a lot of terrible things in my life, but the look in his eyes was beyond anything I had ever encountered. It was pure rage and insanity. Even though he was filthy, his eyes seemed to glow in the dim light of the street lamps. It scared the living daylights out of me. I was so terrified that I took off running. I ran to the nearest payphone. This was back in 1993, and dialed 911. But I didn't go back. I've felt like such a coward ever since, and I have no idea what happened to either of them. I truly hope that she's okay, and that he's dead. Story 31. Back when I was in my early 20s, I used to wander around a neighborhood that was home to many homeless people. I often hung out with a group of about 8 to 10 boys and girls, ranging in age from 9 to 15 years old. I was just a hippie guy trying to get by, so I would sometimes share some pot with them. However, I never stayed long enough to make conversation or anything because the younger kids were into sniffing glue and the older ones were into heavier stuff. The kids had managed to find a secret hideout in an underground water storage tank. It was a place where they could go to escape, hide, and do their usual things. Some of them even spent their nights inside. I don't remember the exact date, but I do remember that autumn was approaching and the days were becoming rainy. One tragic night, the rain quickly turned into a fierce storm. I wasn't there, so I don't know exactly what happened, but the unthinkable occurred. 4 of the kids drowned inside the water tank. It was a horrible tragedy that shook the entire neighborhood. After the incident, the rest of the kids disappeared. Maybe they were rescued, or maybe they just moved on to another place. The water tank was soon sealed off and forgotten, as if it had never existed. Not long after, the neighborhood underwent gentrification, and I don't think anyone remembers what happened to those poor kids. It's a story that has stayed with me all these years, a haunting reminder of the harsh realities that homeless children face every day. Their lives were cut short in such a senseless way, and it's heartbreaking to think that their story has been lost to time, forgotten by a world that moved on without them. Story 32. When I was living in my car, I had an encounter that changed my perspective on homelessness forever. One day, as I was chilling outside a store and eating some food, I struck up a conversation with a woman who was also homeless. As we talked, she shared with me a fact that shocked me to my core. This woman, who I learned was 53 years old, told me that she had been homeless for her entire life. She had never once slept on a proper bed. I was stunned. I couldn't imagine going through life without ever having the comfort and security of a bed to sleep in. It was a concept that was so foreign to me, and yet, here was this woman who had lived it as her reality for over 5 decades. As I listened to her story, I realized that her situation could have easily been mine. It was a scary thought, knowing that homelessness could be a lifelong struggle for some people. That conversation opened my eyes to the harsh realities that so many individuals face every day. Even now, I think about that woman every single day. Her story has stayed with me, serving as a constant reminder of the challenges and hardships that homeless people endure. It has inspired me to be more compassionate and understanding towards those who are less fortunate, and to never take for granted the simple comforts that I have in my life. Meeting that woman was a humbling experience, and it has left an indelible mark on my soul. Her strength and resilience in the face of such adversity are truly inspiring, and I can only hope that someday she will have the opportunity to sleep on a proper bed and experience the comfort and security that she has been denied for so long. Story 33. One night, I found myself in a nightmare situation. A guy had picked me up for a trick, but once we got to his house, he had other plans. He just wanted to hold me, but when I tried to leave, he tied me down and had his way with me. No matter how hard I fought, I couldn't escape. It was only hours later, when he finally passed out, that I managed to run away. I was absolutely terrified. It took me 2 hours to get back to where my boyfriend was waiting. When I told him what had happened, instead of comforting me, he took his broken crack pipe and cut me with it. Why? Because I didn't bring any money back. I was covered in blood, and when a pedestrian saw me, they called the police. But the worst part was yet to come. When the police arrived, and I told them what had happened, giving them the address of the person who had raped me, they dismissed my experience. They told me that just because he didn't pay, it didn't mean it was rape. I was shocked and devastated. This wasn't the first time I had issues with the police not caring about the welfare of the homeless. On another occasion, another girl broke my nose, and I passed out for a few hours. Someone called the police, but when they got there, they said, "Don't bother, she's just a prostitute and not worth the time." It's experiences like these that make me feel like I'm not even human in the eyes of those who are supposed to protect and serve. The trauma of being assaulted and then having my pain ignored by the very people I thought would help me has left deep scars. It's a harsh reality that many homeless individuals face every day, being treated as less than human, as if our lives and our suffering don't matter. Story 34. I've never experienced homelessness myself, but working in a homelessness service has opened my eyes to the harsh realities that people without a roof over their heads face every day. One of my colleagues, who had been homeless in the past, shared a story with me that really put things into perspective. He told me that when he was homeless, he had a sleeping bag and a small tent that he would set up in the woods to sleep in. I couldn't imagine doing that myself. I'd be way too scared. But what he said next really shocked me. And my colleague revealed that when he was sleeping in the city center, he had been pissed on multiple times by passers-by. Even worse, he had actually been set on fire once while he was sleeping. He told me that he would much rather take the very slim chance of bumping into a killer lurking in the forest at night than endure the cruelty he faced on the city streets. It's absolutely heartbreaking to hear about the horrors that homeless individuals have to go through. No one should ever have to choose between the risk of being murdered in the woods or being subjected to such degrading and dangerous treatment by other human beings. This conversation with my colleague has really hammered home the fact that people can be fucking dicks. The lack of empathy and compassion that some individuals show towards those who are less fortunate is truly disturbing. It's a sad reflection of our society when those who are most vulnerable are treated with such disdain and cruelty. Hearing stories like this has only strengthened my resolve to do what I can to help those experiencing homelessness. Everyone deserves to be treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their circumstances. It's up to all of us to show more kindness and understanding towards those who are struggling, and to work towards creating a world where no one has to face such unimaginable hardships. Story 35. We were all camping out in the hills at our local park, a spot everyone called Hobo Hill. Our group, a mix of people aged 18 to 30, liked to hang out in the creek because it was hidden from the road, and the cops usually left us alone. We were sitting there, smoking, and passing a handle of whiskey around. Just another night on the streets. Suddenly, a fight broke out between two guys over the bottle. One of them, a teenager, wouldn't pass it to the other guy. They argued back and forth for a bit, but I didn't think much of it at the time. Fights over bottles are pretty common out here. I went back to smoking and chatting with the guy next to me, not paying too much attention to their squabble. The next thing I knew, the teen was screaming his head off. I looked over and saw that the other guy had grabbed a big rock and smashed it against the kid's head, all because he wanted the damn bottle. Blood was pouring out of the wound, and it was clear that the teen was badly hurt. The attacker just snatched the bottle and started chugging it like nothing had happened. Someone in our group called the cops, telling them where we were so the injured kid could get some help. As soon as the call was made, almost everyone scattered. No one wanted to be around when the authorities showed up. I never saw that teen again after that night. I hope he's okay, and that he maybe went back to his parents' house, considering how young he was. He didn't really come back to the streets after that. It wasn't the worst thing I've seen out here, but it definitely sticks in my mind. It's a harsh reminder of how quickly things can turn violent when you're living on the streets. People can do crazy, brutal things over something as small as a bottle of booze. It's a reality that most folks who have never been homeless can't even imagine. Story 36. I once stayed in a homeless shelter that had separate sections for men and women. It was supposed to be a safe haven, a place where those who had nowhere else to go could find refuge. But during the 8 months I spent in that hell on earth, I discovered the dark and disturbing reality hidden behind its walls. Most of the men staying in the shelter were convicted sex offenders. Let that sink in for a moment. Vulnerable women, many of whom had already experienced trauma and abuse, were forced to share a space with individuals who had a history of sexual violence. It was a recipe for disaster. During my time there, I became friends with 3 women who confided in me that they had been raped by some of these men. The truly horrifying part? The women were actively discouraged from reporting the assaults to anyone, especially the police. The shelter had a sickening policy. If a woman filed a police report about being raped, she would be permanently barred from staying there. It's hard to fathom the level of evil and corruption at play in this place. The Pine Street Inn in Boston, MA, is often celebrated and praised by politicians. The mayor and governor regularly drop by for photo ops, but they have no idea about the horrors that take place behind closed doors. The rapes didn't even occur inside the shelter buildings themselves. The men and women were housed in separate facilities. No, these assaults took place outside, after dark, in areas where the security cameras couldn't capture the crimes. It was a predator's paradise, and the shelter's management seemed more concerned with protecting their reputation than ensuring the safety of the women in their care. It's a sobering reminder that even the places we think of as safe havens can be anything but. The fact that a homeless shelter, a place meant to provide protection and support, to the most vulnerable members of our society, could be so rife with abuse and corruption is a testament to the failings of our system. It's a tragedy that demands our attention and action. Story 37. My husband and I were homeless, but not in the way most people imagine. We saw it coming and prepared for it. We packed our belongings into storage, modified our minivan for survival, and drove to my husband's new job. For 6 months, we lived in our van while I ran my small telecommute business and worked a part-time night shift in retail to secure a safe parking spot. It was a strategic move. By avoiding rent and utilities, we saved enough for a down payment on a house. It was the most millennial thing ever, being secretly homeless on purpose. Despite our bougie homeless status, with our white-collar jobs and gym memberships for showers, we still witnessed the harsh realities of homelessness. I learned that many of my coworkers and customers at the retail store also lived in the parking lot intermittently. The homeless population wasn't the problem. It was the pervasive poverty and lack of support for those trying to make ends meet. I called an ambulance for a child whose mother had overdosed in the bathroom. The kid calmly explained, "She probably just needs Narcan again. It's like how you have to plug in a phone sometimes." The disparity between the mother's expensive purse and cheap shoes made me wonder about her story. A drug dealer caught a shoplifter and made them return the stolen goods, then offered me free marijuana for handling the situation well. I declined politely, citing my asthma, and from then on, the dealer looked out for me, even intervening when a suspicious man followed me to my van late one night. We witnessed screams, crashes, and fights in the parking lot, but we learned never to drive away, as the police would be looking for witnesses. Instead, we'd point our dash cam at the scene and go back to sleep, ready to provide footage if asked. Our retail jobs were our alibi. I carried real and fake work schedules, complete with a secret code to differentiate them, to explain our presence to the cops. As long as we stayed invisible, being bougie homeless wasn't a problem for anyone but ourselves. We even had a stalker for a while, an older man who followed us suspiciously. It turned out he was being tailed by a workers' comp private detective. When we explained our situation, he became a valuable ally in our house hunt. Then there was the young couple with baby twins living in a '94 Toyota because the husband's mother had kicked them out. They managed retail jobs and college while slipping under the radar of social services. When their car broke down, my husband secretly bought the replacement part to help them out. Years later, I ran into the mother at our children's school. They were thriving, with successful careers and a new home. At their housewarming party, we brought a gift, silently acknowledging the bond we had formed during our shared struggle. The worst thing I saw while homeless was that terrible things can happen to good people. My belief that poverty was a result of bad choices or lack of effort was the first casualty of the street. The experience opened my eyes to the systemic issues that perpetuate homelessness and the importance of empathy and support for those facing hardship. Story 38. I spent many years living on the streets of Seattle, and during that time I witnessed some truly horrific things. From brutal fights between homeless people that ended in death, to people casually stepping over an overdosed body outside Macy's, thinking it was just someone sleeping. The depths of human suffering and indifference were on full display. But the worst thing I ever saw still haunts me to this day. There was this notorious drug dealer on Capitol Hill, known for his erratic and violent behavior, fueled by his meth addiction. One day, I watched in horror as he grabbed a 15-year-old homeless girl and threw her off an overpass bridge onto the freeway below. She didn't stand a chance. The image of her small body flying through the air and the sickening sound of the impact will forever be etched into my memory. It's stories like these that people need to hear to understand the harsh realities faced by those living on the streets. These tragedies happen in every large homeless population, and it's up to us to help and support these individuals rather than judge and condemn them. There are so many ways to make a difference in the lives of the homeless in your city. Organize a food drive or put together essential bags filled with items like dry socks, underwear, hand sanitizer, toothbrushes, snacks, and bottled water. Donate sleeping bags or jackets to shelters or directly to homeless individuals. But most importantly, do it out of the kindness of your heart, not for likes or attention on social media. Filming yourself giving to the homeless for clout is cringeworthy and takes away from the true spirit of helping those in need. The homeless are not invisible. They are human beings who have faced unimaginable hardships and deserve our compassion and support. Let's work together to create a world where no one has to endure the horrors I witnessed on the streets of Seattle. Story 39. I've never been homeless, but I once made a really dumb mistake that left me in a pretty scary situation. I had gone to a concert in a faraway town without arranging a ride back or a place to stay for the night. Being young and foolish, I thought I could just wing it. After the concert, I found myself wandering the streets, looking for a safe place to crash. Eventually, I settled on the bed of a random truck parked in a secluded area. It wasn't the most comfortable place to sleep, but it seemed like my best option at the time. Around 5 a.m., I woke up to the sound of voices nearby. Peering out from my makeshift bed, I saw a group of people huddled together, about 10 feet away from the truck. They were completely unaware of my presence, and as I watched, I realized they were doing meth right then and there. I was terrified, but I didn't dare move or make a sound. I lay there, frozen, until the sun finally rose. That's when I met her, a homeless woman who seemed to know the streets like the back of her hand. She spotted me climbing out of the truck bed, looking lost and confused. Without hesitation, she took me under her wing and led me to a nearby donut shop that had just opened. As we sat there sipping coffee and munching on freshly baked donuts, I couldn't help but marvel at her strength and kindness. She was a true boss, navigating the challenges of homelessness with a sense of wisdom and resilience that I could only admire. Story 40. After my family lost our home, we had no choice but to stay in a motel for a while. However, due to the motel's occupancy rules, there wasn't enough room for all of us in one room. Being the oldest, I volunteered to sleep in our car in the parking lot. It wasn't ideal, but at least I had a place to rest my head. One night, as I was trying to get comfortable in the car, a woman pulled into the parking space right next to me. I didn't think much of it at first, figuring she was just another guest at the motel. But then, the motel's security guard showed up, and things took a bizarre turn. For the next 3 hours, I found myself trapped in an incredibly awkward situation. The woman and the security guard proceeded to get high, talk loudly, and then engage in some very intimate activities right there in the car next to me. I tried my best to ignore them, focusing intently on my phone and wishing I could be anywhere else. It was a surreal experience, being so close to something so private and inappropriate, all while dealing with the challenges of being homeless. I couldn't help but feel a mix of discomfort, frustration, and even a bit of absurdity at the whole situation. Looking back, it wasn't scary in the traditional sense, but it was definitely messed up. It was a stark reminder of how vulnerable and exposed you can feel when you don't have a proper place to call home. It also highlighted the lack of privacy and dignity that often comes with homelessness, as well as the unpredictable and sometimes shocking things you might encounter along the way. Story 41. A few years ago, I found myself in a terrifying situation when I got lost in another city in Turkey. My family and I had somehow gotten separated, and I was left alone without my bag, which contained all my important belongings, like my phone, money, ID, and keys. With nowhere else to go, I had no choice but to seek shelter in homeless shelters. To make matters worse, my ordeal coincided with the Turkish coup. The streets were chaos, with people being beaten, sometimes to death, and the constant sound of gunfire and bombs filling the air. The police and everyone else were too busy dealing with the unfolding crisis to help me. I felt utterly alone and helpless. The scariest moment came when a military officer threw Molotov cocktails at a crowd of people. I watched in horror as the flames engulfed everything in their path, and the screams of the injured and frightened echoed through the streets. It was like something out of a nightmare, and I couldn't believe I was witnessing such violence firsthand. For 4 to 5 days, I survived on the streets, sleeping on benches behind closed shops and relying on the kindness of homeless shelters for food and a place to rest. I was constantly on edge, never knowing what new danger might be lurking around the corner. Finally, my cousins found me near the mosque they were visiting at midnight. I was curled up on a bench, exhausted and terrified, but incredibly relieved to see familiar faces. It was a miracle that they had managed to track me down in the midst of all the chaos. Looking back, I am grateful to have survived such a harrowing experience. It taught me the importance of cherishing the safety and stability of home and the love of family. I am thankful to be doing well now, but I will never forget those frightening days when I was lost and alone in the middle of a political upheaval. Story 42. When I was in college, I found myself in a tough situation. For about a month, I lived out of my van, spending my nights sleeping in the park. It wasn't ideal, but I didn't have many other options at the time. Little did I know, one night would change my life forever. I was trying to get some rest when I heard a commotion not too far from where I was parked. At first, I couldn't quite make out what was happening, but as the sounds grew louder and more intense, a sinking feeling settled in my stomach. It was clear that something terrible was taking place. The shouts turned to screams, and I could hear the sickening thuds of what sounded like a brutal beating. I was frozen with fear, my heart pounding in my chest as I strained to listen, hoping against hope that it would stop. But it only got worse. Through the thin walls of my van, I could make out the voices of several men and the agonized cries of a woman. It was then that I realized the true horror of what was happening. A group of local homeless men had attacked a couple, beating the man nearly to death and subjecting the woman to an unspeakable assault. I wanted to help, to call for someone to intervene, but I was paralyzed by terror. The park suddenly felt like a dangerous, lawless place, and I knew I couldn't stay there any longer. As soon as the awful sound subsided, I started my van with shaking hands and drove away, tears streaming down my face. I later learned that the woman had not survived the attack. It was a devastating blow, and the guilt of not being able to help weighed heavily on me. From that moment on, I knew I could never go back to that park, and I had to find a new place to stay. That night left a permanent scar on my psyche. It was a harsh reminder of the cruelty and darkness that can lurk in the world, and how vulnerable we all are, especially those living on the fringes of society. It's a memory that will haunt me forever, and a tragic lesson about the importance of looking out for one another and working to create a safer, more compassionate world for all. Story 43. My mother and I have been homeless on and off for about 5 years now. It's been a tough journey, filled with uncertainty and fear. One particular night, about a year ago, stands out in my memory as a moment when our hearts nearly stopped. On most nights, we would sleep in our usual spot under the tin roof in the dead center of town. But when the weather turned bad, like when it was raining heavily, we had to find shelter elsewhere. That's when we would walk up the street to the local church and carefully shift the trash cans around so we could lay behind them, out of sight and protected from the rain. One or two times as we settled in for the night, trying our best to be inconspicuous, a car would pull into the church parking lot. Sometimes it was a cop, either just sitting there for his shift or maybe checking the area. Whatever the reason, it always set our nerves on edge. On this particular night, we had just gotten comfortable in our sleeping bag when a car pulled in. The headlights beamed directly on us, and we could have sworn we heard a door shut and someone walking around. It felt like they sat there for hours, although it was probably only about 5 minutes. We huddled together in our sleeping bag, hardly daring to breathe. We prayed silently that whoever was out there wouldn't come around to the trash cans we had so carefully arranged. The minutes ticked by, each second feeling like an eternity. Finally, after what seemed like forever, we heard the car make a U-turn and drive away. We were safe, but the relief was short-lived. The fear and anxiety of that moment lingered, a reminder of how vulnerable we were. It's hard to describe the feeling of your stomach climbing into your throat, the way your heart pounds so hard you think it might burst out of your chest. It's a special kind of terror that comes with being homeless, never knowing if you'll be discovered, if you'll be forced to move on or face consequences. That night behind the trash cans may not be scary in the traditional sense, but in the context of our homelessness, it was a heart-stopping moment that I'll never forget. It's a testament to the constant state of uncertainty and fear that comes with not having a stable place to call home. Story 44. I learned a valuable lesson the hard way. If a random drug dealer asks you for a ride home, don't say yes. And if for some reason you do agree, always have an extra set of keys with you. Trust me, it could save you from a whole lot of trouble. It all started when I made the mistake of buying drugs from a dealer I didn't know well. When he asked me for a ride home, I hesitated, but ultimately said yes. I figured it was no big deal, just a quick trip, and then I'd be on my way. Boy, was I wrong. As soon as we got to his place, the guy reached over and snatched my keys right out of the ignition. I was stunned, but before I could react, he said something that made my blood run cold. He told me that if I wanted my keys back, I had to let him get his dick wet. It took me a moment to process what he meant, but when it hit me, I felt sick to my stomach. I knew I was in a dangerous situation, but I also knew I had to keep my cool. Thinking fast, I pretended to start crying, hoping to make things awkward enough that he'd give up and leave. It was a risky move, but to my surprise, it worked. The guy got out of the car, taking my keys with him. As soon as he was out, I locked the doors and reached for my spare set of keys, thanking my lucky stars that I had thought to bring them. With shaking hands, I jammed the key into the ignition and floored it out of there, my heart pounding in my chest. Looking back, I realize how close I came to something truly awful happening. It was a hard lesson to learn, but it's one I'll never forget. Now, I'm always cautious about who I trust, and I never go anywhere without a backup plan. That experience taught me that in the world of drugs and dealing, you can never be too careful. It's a dangerous game, and one wrong move can put you in a situation you may not be able to get out of. I was lucky, but I know not everyone is. So if you ever find yourself in a similar spot, remember my story and think twice before saying yes to a stranger's request. It could be the difference between a close call and a life-altering trauma. Story 45. Being homeless wasn't something I ever expected to experience. I had a pretty sheltered upbringing, so seeing the harsh realities of life on the streets was a real wake-up call. It all started with a series of events that turned my world upside down. One thing led to another, and suddenly, I found myself without a roof over my head. At first, it was really overwhelming. I had never been exposed to the things I started seeing every day. People openly using drugs, rummaging through trash for food, crying themselves to sleep on park benches. It was a lot to take in for someone like me who had led a pretty sheltered life up until then. I had to grow up fast, real fast, to adapt to this new way of living. Even though it was a tough transition, I tried to stay positive and focus on getting back on my feet. There were definitely some dark moments, but I knew I had to keep pushing forward. It wasn't an easy journey, but I was determined to make the best of my situation and come out the other side stronger than before. Story 46. Working in a mountain town was tough. Even with 2 jobs, I could barely afford a place to live. Some nights were particularly harrowing, like the time I was stumbling back to my tent after a long shift, completely wasted. As I was making my way through the dark, I suddenly realized I was being stalked by a mountain lion. I must have looked injured and easy prey. My heart was racing as I kept pointing my digital camera in the direction of the ridge, flashing it repeatedly to try and scare the big cat away. It was one of the most terrifying experiences of my life, but somehow I made it back to my tent safely. Another night after a grueling double shift at Pitas in Paradise, I crawled into my sleeping bag, the smell of gyros still lingering on me. Just as I was drifting off, I heard the unmistakable crunching of a black bear sniffing around my tent. I froze, paralyzed with fear, as the bear's hot breath steamed against the nylon inches above my head. In a moment of sheer panic, I instinctively slapped the bear's nose through the fabric of the tent. Surprisingly, it worked. The bear took off, and I let out a sigh of relief. That was the last straw for me. Soon after, I managed to get an apartment with some friends, grateful to never have to face the dangers of the mountain streets again. Story 47. I was just 19 years old when I found myself homeless. After a few weeks of sleeping rough, I was approached one evening by a man dressed as a priest. I was immediately wary, assuming he was just trying to preach to me about God. But to my surprise, he said, "I'm not here to talk about God. I'm here to make sure you're safe." We ended up talking for quite a while, and as darkness fell, the man offered me a bed for the night. Alarm bells were going off in my head, but he had seemed genuinely kind, so I decided to take a chance. He drove me to a house in the suburbs and asked me to wait in the car while he spoke to someone. A few minutes later, the priest returned with another man who offered to let me sleep in his garage for the night. Every instinct was telling me this was a bad idea, but I had nothing left to lose, so I accepted. The garage was fairly standard, except for a box spring and some blankets in the corner. The man said he'd have to keep the door to the main house locked, as he had kids inside and couldn't take the risk. I didn't sleep a wink that night, terrified that I had made a terrible mistake. But in the morning, the most amazing thing happened. The man knocked on the garage door and asked if he could come in. This might not sound like much, but after living on the streets with zero privacy, having someone respect my space enough to ask permission meant the world to me. I ended up staying in that garage for 7 weeks, during which time the man and the priest worked tirelessly to get me back on my feet. They helped me secure a subsidized efficiency apartment and even got me a job. I will always be indebted to them for their kindness and generosity. It's been over 20 years since then, and I still stay in touch with the man whose garage was my home. Sadly, the priest passed away a few years ago, but I like to think that if there is a heaven, he got fast-tracked in for his selfless acts of compassion. Story 48. I'll never forget that freezing cold night when I was just 17 years old. I was sound asleep in the back seat of my then-girlfriend's parents' car, parked in a garage, when I was suddenly jolted awake by police officers dragging me out. Despite being a 6'2", 210-pound teenager, the cops treated me like a rag doll, yelling about some supposed weapon they had found. I tried to explain that I had permission to be in the car and even offered the parents' number, but they just wouldn't listen. When I asked to see this so-called weapon, they pulled out a window scraper with a squeegee that was covered in a black garbage bag full of clothes for goodwill. I couldn't believe they felt threatened by a squeegee when I was clearly just sleeping, But when I questioned them, they told me to shut the fuck up. Next thing I knew, I was being driven to an all-night laundromat and told to sleep across the hard plastic chairs. The whole experience was infuriating and humiliating. I was just an innocent kid, trying to stay warm on a freezing night, and the police treated me like a dangerous criminal. It's been years since that incident, but the memory still makes my blood boil. The way those cops handled the situation was completely unjust and heavy-handed. I'll never understand how they could feel so threatened by a sleeping teenager with a squeegee. It's a prime example of the mistreatment and abuse of power that too often occurs with law enforcement. I'm just thankful I made it through that night safely, but the trauma of it has stayed with me. Story 49. After being robbed of all my money, I found myself homeless for several months. It was a terrifying experience, especially for the homeless women who were targeted by predatory groups of men. These so-called rape gangs would hunt the women throughout the night, and some were able to escape, while others were not so fortunate. The police never seemed to care about what was happening to us on the streets. They turned a blind eye to the dangers we faced, leaving us vulnerable and unprotected. It was a constant struggle to stay safe, never knowing when the next attack might come. I did my best to avoid the areas where I knew these groups were operating, but it was impossible to completely escape the threat. The fear was always there, weighing on my mind and making it even harder to find the will to keep going. Looking back, I'm amazed that I was able to make it through that ordeal. The trauma of those experiences will stay with me forever, but I'm grateful to have survived. No one should have to endure such horrors, especially without any support from the authorities who are meant to protect us. It's a sobering reminder of the harsh realities faced by the homeless and the urgent need for better resources and protection for the most vulnerable members of our society. Story 50. It was a strange and unsettling sight. The neighbors had caught a homeless man hanging dead seagulls on a clothesline, having shot them down from the sky. They immediately called the gaming warden to report the incident. When the warden arrived and confirmed what the man had done, he prepared to make an arrest. But then the homeless man explained that this was the only way he could feed his family. The warden realized this wasn't just some senseless act of cruelty, but a desperate attempt to survive. Rather than arresting the man, the warden let him off with a warning, on the condition that he would never do it again. Seagulls are a protected animal in that area, after all. As the warden was leaving, he couldn't help but ask out of sheer curiosity, "What do seagulls actually taste like?" The homeless man's response was rather unexpected. "Well, I'd say they taste like a mix between a spotted owl and a California condor," he said. It was a strange and somewhat unsettling answer, but it gave the warden a glimpse into the harsh realities of life on the streets. This incident highlighted the difficult choices and sacrifices that some homeless individuals are forced to make in order to provide for themselves and their families. While shooting protected wildlife is certainly not an acceptable solution, the warden recognized the man's desperation and chose compassion over punishment on that day. It's a stark reminder of the immense challenges faced by those without a stable home or means of support. Story 51. Being homeless meant dealing with all sorts of harrowing situations, run-ins with sketchy characters, uncertain circumstances, and constant feelings of vulnerability. But one particular experience stands out as truly spine-chilling. I had found what seemed like a nice, quiet spot tucked away in the woods, shaded, private, the perfect place to set up my makeshift camp. I settled in and drifted off to sleep, only to be jolted awake in the dead of night by the most guttural, blood-curdling yowls. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I realized I was being surrounded by a pack of feral cats. It seemed the adjacent 50-year-old Rain Man character had been luring them to his property with cans of wet food. Now they were perched on the fence, eyes glowing in the night, staring me down with an intense, predatory gaze. I held my breath, frozen with terror, as we engaged in this eerie standoff. The cats' yowls echoed through the woods, piercing the silence. I had no idea what they might do. Would they pounce? Scratch? Bite? The uncertainty was absolutely chilling. After what felt like an eternity, the cats finally lost interest and slinked back into the shadows. I waited, heart pounding, before quickly packing up my meager belongings and getting the hell out of there. That night in the woods had turned from a quiet refuge into a horrifying, animalistic confrontation. Experiences like that were a constant reminder of the very real dangers that come with living on the streets. You never know what kind of threats might be lurking, ready to pounce when you're at your most vulnerable. It's a level of fear and uncertainty that no one should have to face, and it's a sobering reality for far too many people without a stable, secure place to call home. Story 52. As a woman in my early 20s, I found myself in a difficult situation, completely out of money and sleeping in my car for several weeks. I tried to be smart about it, parking in a small cul-de-sac that seemed to be used only by offices, so I wouldn't be taking anyone's spot. I would leave early in the morning before anyone else arrived. Most nights, I slept like a log, exhausted from all the work I was doing to try to get back on my feet. But one night, I woke up with a feeling of unease. As I looked up, I noticed a softly illuminated window above me, like a warm, grandmotherly bedside lamp. That's when I spotted a silhouette not too far away. A man, just standing there watching me. I immediately grabbed my keys, ready to get out of there as fast as I could. The thing that scared me the most wasn't even the threat of being assaulted or robbed in that moment. It was the realization that this man might have been watching me every other night, and I had been too tired to notice. The thought of being under surveillance, even as I slept in my own car, was absolutely chilling. I booked it out of that cul-de-sac as fast as I could, my heart pounding. I can't even begin to imagine how vulnerable and violated I would have felt if I had known someone had been watching me like that all along. It's a harsh reminder of the dangers that women, especially those in difficult circumstances, can face. Even in a seemingly innocuous situation, there's always the lurking threat of someone with ill intent. That experience has stayed with me, making me even more wary and cautious about my safety. No one should have to live with that kind of fear and uncertainty, especially when they're already struggling to get by. Story 53. I wasn't truly homeless, but I was in a desperate situation. After nearly being strangled to death by my ex, I had no money, no bank card, and was just trying to make it back to my parents' place. I had nothing but the clothes on my back and a dying phone. With no other options, I tried hitchhiking late at night, but eventually gave up and snuck into a barn, hoping to get some rest. Little did I know, I hadn't closed the door all the way, and in the morning, the farmer came to investigate with a shotgun pointed directly at my head. I woke up to the barrel of that gun staring me in the face, and I was absolutely terrified. The farmer demanded to know what I was doing in his barn, and he even asked to see my arms, presumably checking for signs of trouble. In that moment, I thought for sure he was going to shoot. But to my surprise, after hearing my story, the farmer actually turned out to be quite kind. Once he lowered the gun, he invited me back to his house, fed me, and even let me take a shower. It was such an unexpected act of compassion, especially after the sheer terror I had just experienced. This encounter is a stark reminder that even in our darkest moments, there can be glimmers of humanity and kindness from the most unexpected sources. As a woman in a vulnerable situation, I was prepared for the worst, but the farmer showed me empathy and understanding instead of aggression. It's a humbling lesson that not everyone is out to cause harm, even if our circumstances make us wary of trusting others. That farmer's simple act of generosity quite possibly saved me from an even more dire situation. I will never forget his kindness in the face of my desperation. Story 54. When I first visited my father on Maui, I was struck by the sheer number of people living on the streets. One individual in particular stood out. The locals had dubbed him Trash Bag Jesus due to his unique attire. This elderly homeless man would wander the entire Kihei area all day long, wearing nothing but a simple black lawn bag as a makeshift dress. He had no shoes and would talk to himself constantly, lost in his own world. According to my father, the locals would frequently try to give him clothes and food, but he would refuse, likely due to his struggles with paranoid schizophrenia. Despite his unusual appearance and behavior, this trash bag Jesus never bothered or harmed anyone. He was simply existing, trapped in his own personal purgatory on the streets. It was a heartbreaking sight to behold. A human being so disconnected from society, so ravaged by mental illness, with no support system to help him. The contrast between the paradise of Maui and the tragic existence of this man was jarring. While tourists and locals alike enjoyed the beautiful beaches and vibrant community, this individual was left to wander aimlessly, unable to participate or find any semblance of stability. His story is a sobering reminder of the devastating impact of homelessness, especially when compounded by severe mental illness. Trash Bag Jesus was once a person with dreams and a life of his own. Now he was merely existing, a shadow of his former self, lost in a world that had long since forgotten him. It's a heartbreaking tale that speaks to the urgent need for better resources, support systems, and compassion for the most vulnerable members of our society. No one should have to endure such a solitary, destitute existence, especially in the midst of such natural beauty and affluence. The story of Trash Bag Jesus lingers as a haunting reminder of the work we have yet to do. Story 55. After leaving the army, I found myself homeless in Hawaii for about a month. It was a challenging experience, but thankfully, nothing ever felt outright life-threatening. That said, the sheer number of homeless individuals struggling with methamphetamine addiction was truly eye-opening. I witnessed all kinds of bizarre behavior, people arguing with imaginary objects, eating sand at the beach, even wandering around in pants caked with days-old feces. The effects of meth were on full display, and it was a stark reminder of the devastating toll substance abuse can take, especially on those without a stable support system. While the situation was never dire enough that I feared for my own safety, it was still a humbling and often unsettling experience. Seeing the depths of human suffering and psychosis brought on by meth was a sobering contrast to the natural beauty and paradise of Hawaii. My advice to anyone reading this would be to steer clear of meth at all costs. Stick to safer substances like weed or shrooms if that's your thing. The risks simply aren't worth it, as I saw firsthand the incredibly destructive power of that drug, even among the homeless population. Homelessness is challenging enough without the added burden of addiction. I count myself lucky that I was able to get back on my feet without falling into that vicious cycle. For those still struggling, I hope access to proper treatment and support services becomes more readily available. No one deserves to suffer like that, especially in the midst of such natural wonder. Thanks for listening to these regrettable recaps. Please like and subscribe if you'd like more of this content in the future. And watch the video that's on your screen now for more regrettable recaps.